Hi everybody and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. We are now a decade into recreational legalization in the United States. Adult use cannabis economies are now up and running, or somewhat running, in 18 states, and all of them have their own sets of rules and regulations. So what does the economics of legal cannabis look like right now? Where can we find the most traveler-friendly recreational prices and consumption laws? And which states are doing the best and the worst jobs of creating regulations that let their legal weed industries flourish? Or is the underground market still king? This week, we're going to learn about the economics of legal cannabis as an agricultural product. Our guests today are two leading agricultural economists, Professor Dan Sumner and Dr. Robin Goldstein from the University of California, Davis, who have a fascinating new book out called Can Legal Weed Win? The Blunt Realities of Cannabis Economics. Today we're going to get their insights into which states are doing legalization right, how newly legal marijuana markets and farmers can thrive, whether they think federal legalization might help or hurt the legal weed industry, and where we can expect the legal and illegal cannabis markets to go from here. We'll be back after this quick break with Dr. Robin Goldstein and Professor Dan Sumner.
My name is Robin Goldstein, and I'm an economist at UC Davis, and I, along with Dan, direct the Cannabis Economics group there, where we've been working with the California state regulators and doing research on cannabis economics for the last 6 or 7 years.
And this is Dan Sumner. I'm a longtime agricultural economist working on everything related to food, wine, etc., and cannabis was a natural part of that. Decades ago, I was a professor at North Carolina State, and I did a lot of work on tobacco economics, for example. So what I bring to this is cannabis as one more crop that people like to consume.
Thank you both so much for joining me. I am really interested in what you guys have written about in your book, Can Legal Weed Win? So at the moment, 40% of Americans are able to buy legal weed, but it looks like still most folks are turning to illicit markets. And when people are trying to travel, that means that you've got to have a hookup if you want to get the good stuff for the good prices. What are you guys seeing in the moment when it comes to where is the best states to have access to weed? Where are the best prices? Those kinds of things.
I'd say that from the very beginning, the number one cannabis tourism state in America was Colorado. And that's not just because it was the first state to legalize adult use or recreational, but it's true for a number of reasons. Now, as you know, many states have medical cannabis laws where people with medical prescriptions or medical recommendations can buy and consume cannabis legally. However, by and large, that's always limited to people within the state. So you have to be a state resident in any given state to get a medical prescription and therefore use a medical cannabis dispensary. So when we're talking about tourism and between states, it's always about the recreational, when they open recreational, that they're basically opening to tourism. California and Washington were the first two states to do that, to open markets for people from out of state to come, anyone at 21 and over, and consume and buy. And Colorado having a lot of tourism in general, winter tourism with skiing and summer mountains, and Denver being a big tourist city. So they were really well positioned. I was actually in Colorado the first week. I happened to be there the first week when they opened the market, and there were lines. I remember going down the block. I mean, there were like 6-8 hour waits at all these recreational dispensaries that first
Wow.
week. And
What year was
I
that?
believe that was 2014. So they voted to legalize in 2012 and they implemented it and opened the first recreational stores in 2014. And I think that those lines down the block were like 80% tourists.
I bet they were, yeah. So a lot of folks like to come from around other New England states. They did, especially a few years ago, to where I am in Massachusetts, and they would drive across from Rhode Island or Connecticut or New York before they had their legal markets. And we still get a lot of folks coming from Vermont because even though they legalized, they're still waiting for their first shops to open up. So there's a lot of that around New England, but it seems to be less so on the West Coast because every single state down the West Coast has legal rec.
So let me put California in a little perspective there, Britt. California's been in the cannabis business for a long time, and in terms of illegal weed scattered around the United States, probably a lot of that still comes from California. But for legal weed, California has taken a little more aggressive regulatory approach than places like Colorado or even Washington State or Oregon. And when it comes to taxes, California has not been shy about loading taxes on at the state level, at the county level, locally, on cultivation, on retailing, and everything you can think of in between. And so that does make legal weed expensive here.
Yeah.
Some people, that's fine. So they want to go to LA and they want to get a brand named after some movie star and they don't mind paying the high price for fancy packages. Just like you can find wine cheaper than the Napa Valley, but some people go to the Napa Valley. It's a nice place for wine and they pay a lot.
Right.
And that's part of tourism too. But I think Robin started with Colorado because for normal people, finding the place with the highest prices isn't what motivates them. It's the other way around.
Yeah.
California has struggled both for its own residents and for tourism because of this high tax and regulatory scheme. Let me very quickly add that's not the motivation of the regulators themselves. California did this through a ballot initiative, a proposition, I think similar to a number of other places. But here it was written in such detail that the regulators really have a very hard time changing things, even if they think it's perhaps overregulated or some of those regulations aren't really useful.
That seems to be the way across a lot of different industries, right?
Massachusetts, yeah.
Yeah, and states, once something's in law, it's kind of difficult to change it.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at state regulations, everything's different across each of the states. That at the moment, we have 18 states that have recreational weed that folks could travel to and try the different marijuana locally, and you can see what the different cultures are like. But every state has a different regulatory structure. So when you go to different states, you're going to get different levels of pesticide testing, and you're going to get different kinds of rules on the packaging for being childproof. What do you think the regulators can do that would help states' cannabis tourism really thrive?
Let me jump in with Robin's favorite, and I'll let him elaborate. California, for example, says there's no legal cannabis anywhere in the state that you can purchase after 10 p.m. People tell me, I wouldn't know, but people tell me that there are a lot of people out after 10 p.m. and some of them, that's a natural time for people to want to buy cannabis. I say, why don't they plan ahead? And Robin shakes his head sadly and says, not everything can be planned ahead.
Yeah.
What does that do if you're a resident of the state? You call the guy who knows a guy and he'll deliver, and it's not legal, but okay.
Yeah.
If you're a tourist, you're sort of stuck. We also have rules in a lot of places for where you can consume it. A lot of places say, well, you can't consume it in public spaces. Does that include hotels? Some places not. So if you're a tourist, what are you supposed to do? You can't smoke in your room. If you're in a hotel, what are you supposed to do? So these things are complicated for tourism. Most tourists want to be legal. It's a little bit dangerous going to a jurisdiction you don't know. Even stuff you might do at home, you may be hesitant to do while you're a tourist. And this restriction on when you can buy it is one that nobody can quite remember why that was written into the proposition, thinking that it was a good idea. Let's make sure everybody's illegal after 10 p.m. That sounds like a good idea. No, It doesn't. But that's just one that I wanted to highlight right off the bat.
Just to jump in for a second, another one I would flag would be when you think about the history of cannabis tourism, you think first about Amsterdam, where you have people coming from all over the world to buy and smoke weed. A lot of people who made special trips just for that reason. And there, the sort of preferred way of doing it was going into what they call coffee shops. And most people would just buy it to go like we do at our US dispensaries or weed retail stores. But in Amsterdam, one of the big traditions is smoking it on premises in the coffee shop. And in the US, there have been, including California, some states have created legal ways of doing that, said, open the door for Amsterdam style coffee shops. One thing they've done though, is that they've banned alcohol sales or alcohol consumption and tobacco or sales or consumption on the property. If you have a group of people who, some of them want to smoke weed and some of them want to drink a beer, that group can't really go together and have a good time at the weed lounge. And so these weed lounges haven't really taken off. Instead, they go together to a bar where people can drink and other people can go outside and smoke. And in Massachusetts, by the way, Massachusetts is my home state where I grew up. My hometown of Northampton is where Different Leaf started. I met Mike Cusack last year.
What's up? Yeah.
Yeah. Shout out to Massachusetts. Agreed, by the way, on how much tourism they're getting from, especially New York. I think that'll be somewhat threatened by New York legalizing themselves.
Yeah.
And Massachusetts is also considering this now, I think, in the next round of laws, this on-premise, this creating cannabis lounges. I think that tourism and the success of these lounges could be really helped by relaxing this idea that you can't sell a beer and cannabis in the same place.
That's a really good point. I mean, if you couldn't mix your intoxicants, then we wouldn't have liquor and wine in the same place. And I think that if you have the option to buy like a cannabis infused seltzer while your friend has hops in their beer, that would sort of normalize it a little quicker. And I think it would allow for folks who are otherwise sober, I guess what we call Cali sober, when you only consume cannabis, it would it would allow them really to be brought back into the culture of when we get together and drink and smoke together, and it wouldn't sort of isolate them as potheads. You guys go over here, the rest of us can hang out and do our intoxicants over here. I like the idea of expanding the laws to allow more social consumption. That would definitely help. That's one of the big issues we have here. One of the solutions that local entrepreneurs have figured out is to open up a private club that people can just pay to be members of. And then it's bring your own cannabis. This is our building. We allow smoking inside of it. So there are some solutions that we're seeing coming up here. Do you think that there would be any help with tourism in the US when it comes to cannabis if there was national legalization, if we saw something like government shops like they do in Canada?
Let me just say, I think the last thing in the world you want to do is put the government in charge of cannabis retailing.
Good point.
If you've ever tried to buy wine in Canada where they have government retailing for wine, for example, in places in Canada, selection is limited, prices are high, just what you'd expect. I wouldn't want to put the Department of Motor Vehicles in charge of running Uber and Lyft, for example. It's just, you want to go somewhere, make an appointment 6 weeks in advance or something. So that doesn't seem like the solution. What Robin and I say when it comes to federal legalization is two basic things, and I'll let Robin elaborate. First, do no harm as the federal government. We've got plenty of taxes. We got plenty of regulations. The last thing we need is one more layer on top of what we've already got of taxes and regulations. So my view is call cannabis kale. You know, we don't have a bunch of federal regulations on kale, basic safety, but even those are mostly at the state level. So just don't do much from a federal level. The second is the consequences. So think of Massachusetts. If federal cannabis, it was federally legal, which meant, given the US Constitution, there's trade across states. If you're a farmer growing cannabis in Massachusetts, you may be very much like a farmer trying to grow lettuce in Massachusetts. You've got a little local market, maybe, if you're lucky, down at the farmer's market, but all the rest of it's being shipped in from somewhere where it grows better and is cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. And that may well be indoor cannabis from Saskatchewan or maybe British Columbia, where they've got hydropower, and it may be outdoor cannabis from Mississippi. I mean, we really don't know because cannabis hasn't been allowed to find its natural home, really. So we hesitate when we talk about this in the book. We say to growers and retailers and others, don't think federal legalization means a bonanza for everybody, because it normally means things tend to be grown and processed, et cetera, where that can be done most effectively.
And as international trade comes into the picture, and as you see cannabis being legalized in many different countries, cannabis tourists will have choices between visiting the US and visiting other countries. And then comparative prices will come into play just like they do between states. And so, it could be that, again, going back to the federal legalization question, if that makes it much more expensive in the US in general, for whatever reasons, extra taxes, extra regulations, then you could see we're going to lose a lot of weed tourists to Mexico.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to lose a lot of weed tourists to Canada, because there, in many provinces, the government is running things and the prices are on the higher side. But people, ultimately, tourists are going to be price sensitive, and they're going to go to places that not only have great weed, but where it's affordable.
That's what I'm expecting will drive the tourism market as we see cannabis start to legalize across different states, right?
As soon as we have federal legalization and we can move across states, you can also bring cannabis home with you. It's your souvenir, so to speak. And Robin and I have both worked with the wine industry, for example, and they do two things. One, they want everybody, if you're driving home, take a case of wine home with you. If you're flying home, order it here in our tasting room, and we'll make sure we can ship it to you back home. And by the way, you want to join our club, and once a month, we'll send you the new releases, etc. And one can picture that with cannabis. And a lot of us use that sort of thing to remember our vacation. Sure, we could go down to the store and buy a similar product at the local store in Northampton, but once every month or two, we get a few bottles of wine shipped from Sonoma County, and that reminds us of how pretty it was last summer or something.
Yeah.
And I see that with cannabis happening if we don't screw up the regulations.
Right. And there's a lot of room for screw up with these regulations, right?
Yeah.
Do you see there being some part of the US that will end up being the Napa or the Sonoma of cannabis? Is that going to be Humboldt County?
Lots of people would like it to be their county.
Yeah.
And it could be your county in Massachusetts that says, look, we've got really talented people here and they grow it indoors, say, or something like that. And it's really great stuff. Certainly the people from Mendocino to Humboldt and on up would like it to be the Emerald Triangle. It's not clear they really have any big advantage there other than they have a reputation. And of course, that's a great start.
Yeah.
They do have a reputation, but on the other hand, that's been in the Emerald Triangle. That's Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity. They've also had very low adoption rates in terms of how many of the growers there have gone legal. And that's, as we talk about in the book, that's due to a lot of factors. One of the biggest ones just being that if you've been running an illegal or untaxed, unregulated business for many years, the process of getting in, suddenly becoming legal is onerous and impossible for many folks. And so as Dan says, I'm not sure that they're actually going to have as much of an advantage as you might expect. I'm rooting for the Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts. I think it's been interesting to see, not just that there's great weed there, but I think it's been interesting to see how much New England and New York and kind of like Eastern Seaboard has adopted. Massachusetts was the first state in the whole Eastern Seaboard to legalize recreational. In fact, the first legal recreational dispensary east of the Mississippi was Netta in Northampton. The first legal recreational customer at the dispensary to buy a package of weed was Northampton Mayor Dave Narkowitz.
Yeah.
He's a hero that'll go down in the history of the marijuana record books.
Yeah, absolutely. I was working at news radio station in Boston at the time, and I had just started covering cannabis. And I remember that day, there was also another store called Cultivate that opened that same day right down the street in East Hampton. And while we were there, I was speaking to people in line, and the folks in line were not shy about telling me that they had crossed state lines to buy weed here and that they were planning to just drive home to smoke it and to eat it. And they were quite openly telling me, like, yeah, this is the only option we have. It's legal for us to come here. Anybody out of state who's over 21 can buy this weed. And I live half an hour down the street in Connecticut. Why would I not drive up here to take part in this historic day? And I just suddenly thought, man, if they would just legalize consumption lounges right next door, you could have people that stay here and go to the hotels, and then there's folks that frequent the restaurants, and it could really be good for the whole town if you would just allow them to have some place that they could consume nearby, because the rest of the tourism is really already here. There's lots of cafes, there's lots of live music. If you could just give them a place to consume, that's really the missing puzzle piece.
Yeah. It's funny, I saw when you were driving up I-91 from New Haven to the Massachusetts border, even though it's illegal to transport it across state lines by every state law, practically every billboard you see, even on the Connecticut side, is advertising these dispensaries in Massachusetts. So it's clearly happening. I totally agree that having on-premise consumption and building in, and not just on-premise consumption, but things like visits to growers, learning about the process of how it's grown and how to appreciate different types of strains, tastings, things like that. I think there's a big opportunity for Massachusetts, but also around New England for that industry to develop and to feed back into, as you say, local tourism and economic development, just people spending a few days in whatever town it is, Northampton, and supporting the local restaurants and hotels and so forth.
That's a piece of research that Robin and I have worked on when it comes to wine or other industries. We haven't done that yet for cannabis in a quantitative way, in all the algebra and arithmetic. But what I will say is one of our co-authors on some of our work is an economic historian who wrote a history of the North Coast, the Napa Valley of California after Prohibition and the development of that industry. He wrote a famous book called Bottled Poetry, which is talking about wine as bottled poetry, a famous quote from Robert Louis Stevenson, in fact. And I'm enticing Jim to write I don't know what his title would be, the idea that wheat tourism in building this industry with a reputation somewhere. And Of course, there are lots of places in the world where people go to consume wine and appreciate it. And even on the East Coast, Robin and I, a couple of years ago, went to a meeting in Ithaca, and then people were celebrating, of course, the New York State wine industry at that meeting with tourism. It doesn't have to be a single place, of course. The other point, and what I really like with your conversation about the role of Massachusetts, is most tourism really is local. It's nearby. And most of us wish we were flying off to Switzerland or like Robin off to Italy this time of year, but we don't. We drive 100 miles or somewhere nice that's nearby. And that's most tourism. And cannabis tourism can be the same sort of thing. So you come from Connecticut or you come down from Vermont, or in California, you fly off to Las Vegas for a different kind of experience, or you go up to the mountains for a different kind of experience. So there really are opportunities, even within states or within regions, for tourism here.
Definitely, there's a difference, like Robin was saying, between Eastern and Western Massachusetts. I'm kind of hoping for the Pioneer Valley as well to do really well, because Western Mass is gorgeous. And I think it's this really untapped area that not a lot of folks that aren't from sort of the Northeast even know about. I didn't know about it until I moved here about 5 years ago. And folks told me, oh, as soon as they start doing weed out west, that's where you need to get your buds from. And lo and behold, the west side of the state, I think, does some of the best weed there is. And it's because they've got that history as farmers,
Even I've been to Western Massachusetts, so there you have it.
And Dan almost never leaves his little backyard.
Yeah.
His office, his home office. One cool thing about Mass also is, or about Western Mass rather, just the quality of the product. One challenge in that regard I wanted to add is that there's a reputation, let's say, or word on the street has it that actually some of the best weed you can get in Western Mass is illegal.
Yeah.
A lot of the best growers, the people who are the most concerned with getting the highest either potency or these kind of elite strains and really curating it, have decided not to get into the legal market. And so my hope is that over time, as the industry develops, that'll change and that they'll start to be able to get the best quality stuff on the legal market as well as the illegal market.
There's one grower I know who's doing that, goes by the name of ChemDog. We have had an episode with him, and he is dead set on bringing really, really good, formerly underground strains above ground so that it can help his local economy.
ChemDog is huge on the West Coast now, and not many people know it came from Western Mass.
Yeah, proud of it. So let's talk about where you guys think the cannabis market is going to go from here. Are there states that you think that should be emulated for future states that want to start their own recreational licenses?
The policy lessons are more often, here's some things not to do. And part of it is we want lots of good things. So in the case of cannabis, we don't want anybody getting sick from pesticides or other stuff. So let's make it pure. Let's make it so pure it's purer than organic parsley. Well, what does that mean? That means if somebody a mile away has used a perfectly legal pesticide that's safe for human consumption, if it's found on weed in California, that weed is tossed out. You test every little batch because you wouldn't want anything to get in there. And on and on. We don't want anybody getting sick, but you can overdo it.
Yeah.
We don't want crime associated with legal weed. So let's close the stores. Well, why don't we just have them open for 1 hour a day between 3 and 4 in the afternoon and have 3 policemen at every door to make sure nothing bad happens? We didn't quite go that far, but California was actually on the verge of, for example, for delivery services, having an armed guard. People were talking about, well, gee, you should deliver this in armored trucks or something. Until somebody pointed out that you could put $500,000 worth of weed in the front seat of your Pinto. It's a pretty valuable thing per unit of weight. So they backed off on some of these things. So the point is, first do no harm, I think, is really the motto here for regulators. In the book, we talk a bit about Oklahoma, which was only medical weed, but you mentioned Vermont, still not an open dispensary. Yeah. Colorado, the first dispensary, and it was medical dispensary, was open the day the law passed because they were ready. I like to say it this way. Colorado said, the politicians said, we don't want weed. We don't like it. But when the people approved it, they said, but we do like business. And so now weed wasn't this illegal drug. Now it was business. They like to be business friendly. Vermont, of course, likes weed but doesn't like business. So they decided to be unfriendly to any business, including weed business. And that's something people sort of have to get over. One more quick example. We all want to be fair to people that had been in the weed business and maybe needed a leg up to get their own businesses started. That's great. But then you put that into regulations and it ends up being 20 pages of regulations and forms to fill out and this sort of thing. And the person that you're trying to encourage looks at that and said, "You mean I hire a lawyer and pay them $100,000 to prove that I have all these qualifications? Never mind, I'll just stay illegal."
Yeah.
And that's the sort of things that have happened where we've made it just the licensing process so complicated and with such delay. Vermont may be setting the record, but there's a lot of places with complicated licensing processes that are very expensive. So step one, hire a consultant. Step two, hire a lawyer. Step three, maybe think about growing wheat, but that's way down the list. First, you have to have the lawyers and the consultants. That's too
Yeah.
bad, I think.
So there are a couple states where you'd take a little pinch of this and a pinch of that, but so far there's not really been any state that has done it the way that you think should work across all states.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for tourism, for example, Nevada has done an interesting job with tourism. I mean, obviously, Las Vegas is just this huge tourist destination. One thing they've done right is they have 24-hour weed retail.
Right.
They don't have it on the strip, maybe wisely, I'm not sure. Just off the strip, they've got places that you can go all night. And so they have these gigantic I don't know how many thousand square feet. You know, I think the biggest weed retailer in the country is in Vegas. And so they created kind of like Vegas just does everything epic. And so he's created these places that are where just going to the store is an attraction in and of itself.
Yeah.
The fact that you can go all night long is a big draw. On the flip side, Vegas has actually added a lot of taxes and regulations that make it more expensive than some other states. And so they're not competing that well on price. Oklahoma is competing very well on price by just making it really cheap, as Dan mentioned, easy to get into the industry. So you have a lot of competition. And so obviously competition is one of the things that brings prices down over time.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think this is going to grow over time? So maybe 30 years down the road, do you still think it's going to be Vegas is the destination where you go to see all the biggest stores and hopefully by then Oklahoma will have rec weed and it'll still be somehow the cheapest? Or do you think that other states will have figured out how to get themselves in the game?
Brit, this could go in a couple of different directions. And so we avoid saying we predict the future in this way. It's more of a what if thing. We do expect federal legalization. If you go out 20 or 30 years, that's almost surely going to happen. 5 years, who knows? But 20 or 30 years, almost surely. We think that the legal industry will put enough pressure on the regulators to say, you really don't want it continue to be 3/4 illegal. That's not what anybody wants here. So what can we do? One thing we point out very strongly to investors and even consumers is that the more it's legal and brought into the regular system, innovations happen in production, at the farm level, in processing, and good things that happen in the food industry or the wine industry, or for that matter, the tobacco industry, standardization and the sort of things that made cigarettes cheap, which now doesn't sound like a good idea to most of us. But those kind of technologies and things, some of it associated with scale and some of it just applying good old fashioned agricultural sciences and good practices and smart people trying things half a dozen different ways year after year after year. So we think weed's going to get cheaper in real terms. Now inflation will go its way, but I'm talking about relative to other stuff.
Yeah.
And part of that will happen because it'll be growing where it grows best. You may grow just like you may grow tomatoes in your backyard or strawberries. The routine stuff will be in the market. We think you don't have to have specialized weed stores. States may regulate it differently. Some states say, well, you can't buy liquor in a grocery store. Okay,
Right.
so maybe that'll happen, but other states will sure say, fine. We've got to be careful about checking IDs and all that, but weed's much more widely available. Those are all things that make it more routine, like other intoxicants. And we see that bringing the prices down all the way through the system. Now, one thing that means is that people are saying, oh, legal weed's $100 billion industry or something. Well, you may have higher quantities, but if prices are a lot lower, it's hard to get these massive dollar numbers that some people claim will be happening. We don't see weed being 3 times as big as the beer industry, for example, in value. Some people are saying the prices stay high and quantity goes up. Well, that's a
Yeah.
little hard to achieve. We're not thinking that's going to be happening.
Do you think it would rival the alcohol and the tobacco industries eventually?
Maybe it'll rival, but we don't think it'll surpass. Probably not. I guess it's probably not. But I think your previous question was a good one about what states will thrive in the future, 30 years from now, let's say, also in terms of tourism. One thing I was going to add there is that there are some states and some regions like Humboldt County that have pre-existing reputation. You know, they're already known for high quality weed. It's a place you think about. Those kind of high quality reputation places will have a chance to survive even as there's low price competition from other states if they're able to market their reputation the way that Napa Valley has with wine. Wine tourists don't flock to the places that have the cheapest wine.
Right.
Consumers in your average store might buy the cheapest weed for the most part, but when people want to go on a vacation and experience the culture and learn about the process and sample the goods, they're going to go to a place that has a reputation for high quality, even if it's associated with a higher price. So there's going to be a marketing battle that's going to play out in the next few decades between states and regions within states to say, what can you do to bring out in the public eye the uniqueness of your product? Why is it cool to come from this place? What's different about the weed? What's different about the taste of it? What's different about the psychological effects? What's different about how we grow it and where? People behind it, getting to know the people behind it. It's another part of the marketing. And I think one interesting phenomenon we also talk about in the book is that if you really want to market weed for around where it comes from and promote your local region as a selling point, outdoor grown weed has more powerful statement to make in that regard than indoor grown weed. When you do it inside a warehouse or even a greenhouse, it's not as dependent on the climate. Whereas wine is all outdoor grown. Beer is not outdoor grown. So people don't necessarily talk about the climate when they talk about which beer to choose. So right now you have this situation where, for mostly historical reasons, the highest quote unquote quality, which is basically meaning the highest potency weed, is mostly indoor.
Right.
I think that in the future, we're going to see a development of very high quality outdoor that will ultimately be a better driver of what regions will emerge as the famous regions for weed.
Wow.
And they're not necessarily the high volume regions.
Right.
If you go to France, I'm hesitant to talk about it, but Robin actually has a PhD from the University of Bordeaux. But if you went to Bordeaux for wine, there are the fancy ones, the ones that you and I can't afford, Brit.
Me neither.
But the rest of Bordeaux produces a lot of cheap red wine and cheap white wine, and it's fine. It's perfectly good wine. It's just the sort of stuff that people in France buy at the supermarket and use, and they know that. Many of the rest of us think of Bordeaux as being this special place. It must be really expensive because we see these bottles priced at $100 a bottle or more than that. What I'm saying is it may well be the case that there are ranges of cannabis, as there are now, and still the bulk cannabis, the everyday cannabis, so to speak, or the every Thursday cannabis may be the stuff that is grown indoors, very well produced, potency you want, it's used in manufactured products, etc. And then on your anniversary or something, you buy the fancy stuff from Humboldt or from Western Massachusetts or something.
Yeah, so we got to keep the craft cannabis alive, right?
I don't think we have to do much to do that other than make sure we don't regulate them or tax them out of the business. For example, being able to ship cannabis across state lines without armed guards following it or something, which will make it prohibitively expensive. And those are the sort of things you could imagine somebody in the U.S. Congress saying, sure, we'll make it legal, but here's a bunch of rules that have to go with it. And you'd say, well, gee, thank you very much, but no thank you.
Yeah, you're going to kill that industry, really. Before I let you go, is there anywhere in particular that the two of you would choose at the moment as your most, I guess, highly rated, most friendly, best weed, sort of for the price place that we can visit in the US at the moment?
I'm going to have to stick with my previous point and be completely biased toward my home region of Western Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Dan, we'll see what Dan says.
And I'll just remind Robin that he works at the University of California, for gosh sake. So, and I'll just let it go at that. I'm sure there are lots of places here and there, and somebody will say it's Vancouver, Canada, and somebody else will say, yeah, but you really got to try the Peace River in northern Alberta province. And boy, that's where I think there are plenty of places that can compete in this market.
I'd add Washington to the list because they've basically got about the best value weed in the country right now. You mentioned value. So I think they'd be on the short, and also a great place to visit on top of that. So I think they're in the short list of most appealing places right now.
Go skiing in Colorado, Robin, and then go in the summer in Western Massachusetts, maybe.
October for the fall
Sounds
foliage.
like a perfect little getaway.
Ah, there you go. Don't forget Tanglewood.
Oh, yeah. Now
Go
you're
listen to
talking.
some music.
Oh, yeah.
Of course. All right. Well, there are a lot of really great places where you can buy legal weed and go and enjoy the local culture and the local nature. Hopefully, we'll see more of those great places opening up.
It'll be really cool. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for joining me today. This is a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Brit.
Thank you, Britt. It's a lot of fun.
A big thanks to today's guests, Dr. Robin Goldstein and Professor Dan Sumner from UC Davis. Be sure to check out their fascinating new book, Can Legal Weed Win? The Blunt Realities of Cannabis Economics. Next week, we're going to check back in with Boundless Robotics founder Carl Palm, the company behind the East Coast's new at-home cannabis growing robot, the Anaboto.
So essentially what happens is there's a fan that sucks in the air and cleans it. And then we take that air and we blow it down the legs, and the legs have a particular hole pattern and angle that then creates a little tornado inside that creates a negative pressure system. So it contains the odor and it just kind of cleans it. But because it's a negative pressure system, also if you're like smoking next to it, it'll suck in that smoke and clean it.
Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you're listening right now, and follow us on social media @differentleaf and @different_leaf. And I'm at Brit the British. Check out differentleaf.com, where you can purchase all the issues of Different Leaf the magazine, including the new summer issue all about cannabis, travel, and tourism. That's differentleaf.com.